Hey, this is Enaa, in with you in the fight back. And today I want to talk about Slavoj Zizek's Violence, which came out several years ago. Like many of Zizek's works, this is often kind of muddled in places and rather hard to follow, and he does use the Lacanian language, which can make it difficult if you're not familiar. But like all of Zizek's works, it's an intriguing read and it poses some fascinating questions. Now, violence Zizek is looking at, for instance, normally we look at two sets of violence, the subjective and the objective. Violence in the subjective case carried out by like individual agents. This would be like terror and mass murder. And we have objective with, racism and whatnot. And supposedly this can be dealt with and these two forms of violence can be dealt with rather differently, and they're often we encourage like lawbreakers, those who commit murder should be put in jail in the case of the subjective violence. And objective, well, if we have hate speech, racism, we need to pass political correctness law. But Zizek says in looking at these two forms of violence, we ignore the third, and that is the systemic, and that is the larger system that creates it, and the exploitation of capitalism. And we see that too often we're willing to ignore that because some let's look at the systemic for a minute, and let's look at those who supposedly want to deal with the forms of subjective and objective forms of violence. And Zizek calls them the liberal communists. I object to dirtying the word communist on them, but that's beside the point. He looks at people like George Soros or Bill Gates, humanitarians, philanthropists, and they've grown rich, and they supposedly want to end hunger, they want to fight racism and poverty, and they're really concerned about that. And they want to do something about it. And they're willing to give away their wealth to do it. Yet, they perpetuate the system. Think about it for a minute. In order for Bill Gates or George Soros to be able to give away their wealth, they actually have to create it. Arguably, it's the workers under them who do it, but that's beside the point. They need to create that wealth. And that whole system of exploitation and capitalism is engendered through their activity. And he also, Zizek gives a wonderful example of King Leopold of Belgium, who built great public works for Belgium and all that. But to do that, the Congo, or what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, was a Belgian colony, which was subjected to horrible genocide, forced labor. So, in a sense, for that comfortable life in Belgium to be possible, or for the comfortable reflections of the Bill Gates or the George Soros to be possible, we need, on the other hand, the exploitation and the mass murder in the Congo, or the speculation that destroys currencies of George Soros, these manifestations of a greater system. And I really like how Zizek ties this together. And of course, he does it in a provocative way, to be sure, and that's what he. And Zizek says capital's apologists, these Gates, these Soroses, they want to fight violence. They urge to do something about it, to do humanitarian intervention to stop mass murder and terror, like in Libya, for example, or Iraq, or wherever. And Zizek says, stop. We're falling into the trap if we do that. If we're doing what these liberal communists, these capital apologists are doing. Because what we should be doing is learning what really causes these forms of violence. And I have to say that makes Zizek so refreshing from, say, the rubbish you read in most of, say, the more liberal publications out there, those who supposedly are progressive, but we got to support Obama because he's going to stop the mass murder in Libya or whatnot. But Zizek is saying, well, let's hold on a minute, let's go down there, let's actually see what's really causing the violence, and that's really a good message from this part of the book. And even the most, Zizek is saying also, even the most universal ethics are not obligated to draw a line and they're actually obligated, in a sense, to ignore some sort of suffering. For instance, the life we have, whether it's in the United States or Britain, is comparative to a lot of the world is rather, comfortable. But it's founded on these horrible systems of violence, the systemic violence, the exploitation, imperialism, and whatnot. And to maintain our comfortable lives, this violence has to exist. So if we knew on the one hand that the torture of people would supposedly save lives or keep us comfortable, keep our way of life intact or whatnot, would we be willing to tolerate it? And Zizek, he kind of tears through. It's like it would be rather hard because we're willing to ignore the suffering, many people, of people in the third world that make our comfortable lives possible. But if we were to see it up close, the torture that occurs, that we'd be more squeamish. And he looks at how universal ethics, for instance, Christianity, supposedly is the brotherhood of all believers, but in that sense you need the non-believers outside of it. Those who don't accept are excluded. They're seen almost as less than human. And he cites the example of the Iranian Revolution, where Khomeini said no people were killed in this, and the response was, what about all these people executed here? And he's like, oh, they're just dogs, they're not human. And it's the sense they're excluded from the so-called universal ethics that are extolled. And Zizek also looks at how language is a divider, and the verbal violence that shows how we are delineated or divided into different groups. For instance, when an anti-Semite uses the word Jew, is that the word Jew contains certain stereotypes, certain constructed images. So when they actually see an actual Jew, that those constructions that have been formed through forms of language they're kind of transposed onto the person of Jew. Now, I'm not sure how much of the whole language thing I buy into, but it certainly is a provocative argument, to be sure. And furthermore, it's just Zizek is kind of telling us to look at the systemic, the often silent forms of violence. I don't necessarily like that term, but to look past that and to look what's actually causing violence, as opposed to just looking at the subjective and objective, but the systemic at the same time. Zizek looks at also the Paris riots of 2005, 2006, with the largely immigrant Arab population was rioting against the establishment, and he says they were really meaningless. And he compares them to 1968 in Paris, where the revolt there was taking a utopian, it had political form, and he's saying that these people are just, it's a meaningless riot. They're not really asking for anything in a sense. And he's saying that in this society, in French society, that supposedly society founded upon free choice, that these people are told to play by the rules, and when they do, nothing's really happening. They're still excluded, but the only way they can actually do anything is through destructive violence. And they want to be treated as citizens, but not separated. And in a sense, they're asking the system to play by its own rules. So in a sense, they're almost accepting the whole language of the system. And for me, I hadn't looked too closely at the Paris riots of '05, but it certainly provides a new perspective. And without further study, I won't comment more on that. And Zizek also is looking, furthermore, in the book, he looks at the founding violence of the state, how it's legitimized. For instance, the example he keeps citing is Israel, which is founded upon, supposedly, because of the tragedy of the Holocaust, justifies it. And the arguments of terror, well, they were actually used in the founding of Israel. If you look at, say, the founders of Israel, like David Ben-Gurion and Begin, you can see that they're almost using, in a sense, as Zizek says, the same arguments they attribute to the Palestinians. And he's saying, and I'm not sure how much of this I agree with, but that a true political act in the Palestine-Israel situation would be to render the for both sides to pretty much give up their claims to like Jerusalem and to act like there is no national separation. Perhaps I'm getting the argument wrong, but it seems like until that material reality changes, and also that Rabin he praises for making the unthinkable thinkable as a true political act when he talks with the Palestinians. Giving Rabin a little too much credit, considering I think the Oslo Accords were pretty much legitimized what was going on there, but still, I think Zizek oftentimes, at least on Palestine, a little muddled, but still very provocative in what he's saying. And here's something else I rather enjoyed about this book, and it's not something we see too often nowadays. And there's a real positive atheism instead of a lot of and he turns something around and he says too often we say, well, if there is no God, then all is permitted. You can do whatever you want. You can kill, have sex with whoever you want. And the typical Christian right crap. But he's turning that around. He's saying, if there is a God, everything is permitted. Killing in the name of God, because you have a direct link to God, and you supposedly want to carry out His will. That justifications the violation of the so-called moral tenets of that religion and human constraints. And he's saying atheism, on the other hand, is you need it. It's good for the sake of it, because for a fundamentalist, you're good because you want to fulfill God's will. But he's saying an atheist, on the other hand, is good because it's the right thing to do, and an atheist can accept reality and find their place in it. I argue an atheist should not only accept reality but change it, and I believe Zizek does as well. But his point is well made, and he's saying also in dealing with Muslims, especially, and he uses the example of the Prophet Muhammad cartoon a lot from Denmark, that they should be treated with respect, and they should be submitted. Their beliefs, of course, should be submitted to critical analysis, and they should also be seen as responsible for their beliefs. And he sees problems with this because too often, and he makes some really valid points that tear through a lot of the political correctness stuff we have to deal with about tolerance and intolerance. And rather, because problems of tolerance are seen as problems that ignore conditions of, say, inequality and exploitation, injustice. And he's saying that tolerance is seen as a remedy to this supposed situation, when in fact it's really why. And he says, why not emancipation, social change, armed struggle? Well, of course. And he says the liberals, they connect political and economics that are supposedly that are kind of ignored, and they're kind of almost like political and economic differences are naturalized as culture and ways of life, and they can't be overcome. They can only really be tolerated. And in a sense, this is really, and when Zizek says that, for instance, these differences of economic and politics, or social as well, are naturalized in culture, he's saying, well, we can kind of go on a dangerous road here. We get the Samuel Huntington with the clash of civilizations between different civilizations, of course, Muslim, Christian, and whatnot. And respect for others is often, it's almost like a strange form of racism, and it justifies certain horrible situations. Because if these differences between, say, immigrant populations wherever and whites or whomever are naturalized, because it's culture is naturally, you can't change it. It's we're leaving politics and economics out of it, of course, in this view, and they choose their own way of life. In a sense, it's natural to them, and we should respect it. Well, when should we respect in China when they had the revolution and they got rid of, say, the drug dealers, the opium dealers, the landlords that had been there for thousands of years? Should that be respected as a way of life, or shouldn't universal forms of emancipation be rather a guiding principle? And he's saying that the tension of the universal and the historical context is inscribed in the very nature of certain forms of thought. For instance, he uses Nietzsche and Marx also. And in every culture, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in England or Asia, you have protests. You have people fighting against, for instance, mutilation of women, or you have peasants fighting back, or you have workers going on strike. And they protest against these particularities of their situation. But wherever it is, it's almost formulated, and he's saying formulated in the sense of universality, that the particular is dialectically linked to the universal, because that's part of the strength of universal forms of thought, that it can be adapted to the particular. And in a revolution, there's unity in the same struggle. When you see the same intolerance of oppression, you join together, you're fighting back. And that's a rather positive vision, and I like that Zizek gets at that. He goes about it at quite a roundabout way at times, but it's still there, and it's still a good message of this. Something else Zizek looks at is the habits, the unwritten rules and the mores of the society we live in, and we have to follow them to get along. They define us as social beings. For instance, and he uses the example of the Soviet Union, where if you wanted a new apartment or a new job, or your kid to get in a good college or something, you knew who to bribe, you knew what to do, and all that. And part of the transition from during the Yeltsin period was you didn't know. It was like all these mores were in flux. And he's saying that radicals, we need to break through these unspoken underpinnings of daily life, because we have, like, for instance, Abu Ghraib, that it was looked at upon as like for too many people, as like the underside of American values, as something that was contrary to the supposed U.S. respect for the human person. But he's saying, and if we look at this with the forms of systemic violence he spoke of earlier, that the violations at Abu Ghraib, the tortures, that they are a necessary supplement to the public values of personal dignity and democracy that are still, they're obviously not really carried out. We all know that. And he's saying, because suddenly they were brought in the open. The violence at Abu Ghraib, the torture of prisoners there, is necessary for also the formal functioning of democracy and freedom as a public facade. In the same sense that the exploitation of peasants or workers in the third world is necessary for the supposed comfort we enjoy in Western society. And he's saying that throughout human history, there has been a growing normalization of violence and suffering, that it seems to grow more natural. And he looks at how to remedy this, and he looks at using Walter Benjamin's arguments of divine violence. And this poses some rather provocative questions in the book. And he's saying that if he's contrasting divine violence to mythical violence, and this is mythical violence in a sense is where we have a judgment day, that great big event, like a revolution that sweeps the slate clean, where all the injustices and whatnot are remembered and they're just dealt with, and it's just a clean sweep. And he's saying divine violence is something a little different. So what is divine violence that Zizek is advocating? He's saying it comes out of an event, Alain Badiou, which I'll speak of him another day. And it's not a last judgment. It's like the one event that sweeps away everything, like the apocalypse in Christianity. Or it's not the state founding violence of, say, Israel or the United States or wherever. That it is, we make our decisions heroically, to whether to sacrifice, to take life, is made in solitude, and it's a sovereign decision, because there is no God, we're condemned to be free. And he uses Che Guevara to kind of bring this point out, where Che says a revolutionary is guided by feelings of love, but Che, on the other hand, says we need to hate the enemy, we need to be merciless towards them. And he kind of paraphrases Robespierre here by saying we need to be hard without losing tenderness. And we need to cruelty without love is blind. Love without cruelty is powerless. So love needs hatred. You need to be an active force for love. It's rather strange and provocative, but certainly makes a very interesting point that we don't too often hear. Now, the point of this book is rather threefold. He says to chastise violence outright is an ideological operation that renders invisible forms of social violence, like capitalism, for instance. And when we just talk about we need to have humanitarian intervention, we're really ignoring the conditions that are giving that about. And it is difficult to be violent to perform an act that violates and disturbs the basic parameters of social life, and that and for instance, too often this is done reactively, like the Stalin terror. That real radical, it was just reactive. It just gets out of control and everything. It's not really changing anything. And he says that real radical violence is active. It enforces a vision. For instance, the Red Terror in the Soviet Union during the early Russian Revolution, and Robespierre and the Reign of Terror in France in the 1700s. And I would argue, for instance, some also reconstruction in a certain sense in the United States, where we're forcing a vision on them there, on the former slave owners. And he's saying that also there's a relation, of course, between the subjective, objective forms of violence and the systemic, and there's the same acts are distributed between them, and they deal in different contexts. So, for instance, the hates like racism or mass murder, forms of, say, subjective or objective violence, they grow out of the systemic capitalism, the larger social totality that we have to live in. And what Zizek advocates, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I really want to throw it out there. If you know this channel, you know that I said it doesn't really matter who the hell you vote for instance, Obama and whoever the Republican is. And Zizek's saying, what if we just abstained? What if we do nothing, not partake in the rituals of bourgeois democracy, voting and being good citizens? And because too often we're looking at these, because this is really, if we vote and we do the rituals of the society we live in, it's really a form of pseudo activity that doesn't really change anything. We'll have conferences on stuff, we'll have debates and petitions, but are we really changing anything? I don't know. I don't think so. It's like meaningless debate. And he's saying doing nothing, not accepting these rituals, is a violent act. I don't know, and I'd like to pose that question to you, the viewers of this channel, and the readers of Slavoj Zizek, because I don't know. He poses the question, and I would be too arrogant to say I have the total answer for you. Because he's what do we do? And that's the question. And Zizek does offer some answers in other of his works, but how should we respond? What does doing nothing mean? I don't know, but this is a very provocative book. I recommend you pick it up. Again, the language is difficult. It's kind of roundabout. You're probably going to have to take some extensive notes at times like I do. But pick it up. Zizek, if nothing, is entertaining. And this is Enaa. Until next time.